Hello class, welcome to our third lecture on Buddhism in this unit. And today we're going to talk about the teachings about the reality of suffering and the middle path, the early councils and early divisions within Buddhism, and we'll talk about the philosophical teachings about the middle path. And I may blend these a little bit when we're talking about the middle path. But let me remind you about the reality of suffering. Remember, the central teaching that the Buddha discovered was all is dukkha, all is suffering. Dukkha arises and dukkha ceases. And we use the Eightfold Path to bring about the cessation of dukkha. All right, so the philosophical side of Buddhism. Remember, philosophy asks these questions: how do we know? That's epistemology. What is real? That is metaphysics. And what is the good life? Or what ought I to do? That's ethics. Buddhism puts the emphasis on ethics, on living life. This is the practical side of things, how to live. And then they emphasize the Eightfold Path as the ethical way of living. So let's talk about the ethical middle path first. Remember, the middle path, we want to avoid extremes. So in the ethical aspect, the middle path is not ascetic, self-denial, like the Buddha was living off of 1 grain of rice a day, not that. And it's not indulgent, the life he had in the palace, self-indulgence. It's somewhere in the middle between that. Another piece of the ethical middle path is it's not overly optimistic, like very hopeful, and it's not pessimistic, no hope. They would rather say the realistic, okay? Not optimistic, not pessimistic, realistic. And then there's this emphasis on suffering and how to be released from this cycle of birth, death, rebirth, birth, death, rebirth, reincarnation. So the emphasis is on the way of life to be released from that cycle through nirvana. Okay, we've talked about that. Now let's talk about the metaphysical middle path. Remember, metaphysics is asking what is real, what is eternal. Now, the main philosopher for the middle path in Buddhism is Nagarjuna, and he's living around 200 Common Era, about 700 years after the Buddha. And he is systematizing this teaching about the middle path. And so I'm going to just focus on a few points. Your textbook will tell you more about Nagarjuna. He's going to say there's a middle path between all is eternal, like Hinduism would say all is one. Remember, all is spirit, all is one. He's going to say not that. But it's not nihilism either, which is nothing is eternal. So it's not all or nothing. Now, what he's going to say is not some is eternal, which would be a nice alternative, but he says the process is eternal, the process of things becoming. So the only thing that exists is the now. So there's no matter that exists, there's no spirit that exists, there's no being, there's only becoming. And this is a view that was taught also by the philosopher Heraclitus in the West, if you're familiar with him. And this is something that Nietzsche was teaching in the West. So it's not a foreign idea to us. All is flux. Think of it that way. All is impermanence. So there's no individual soul. That's eternal, like Hinduism. And yourself. What is happening right now? It's a series of thought moments. So this is interesting, though. A series of thought moments. That's what you are. So one thought moment gives rise to the next thought moment. And the question, though, is there any causal connection between the moments, or is each moment an uncaused event? That's perhaps an objection that could be raised to this momentariness. But in Buddhism, what one wants to do is end this process. It's called dependent co-arising. So the moment now is dependent on the previous moment, but it's not caused by the previous moment. I know it might sound a little fishy, but metaphysically you should think about it. Is it possible that there's a momentariness without causation? Okay, so all is flux, all is impermanence. And that's the metaphysical side of suffering, too. When you realize that all is impermanence, that is the source of suffering. Okay, there's one more piece to this middle path, and that's the epistemological middle path. Epistemology, how do I know stuff? So how do we know in Buddhism? So here's the thing, we talked about it last video. The intellect cannot grasp ultimate reality, so we can't understand it. The more we try to understand it, the more we'll cause ourselves suffering, remember? Because we're desiring to know, and that causes suffering too. All concepts are empty, and they break down under scrutiny. So in Western philosophy, let's say Plato and Aristotle, concepts are in our mind, and concepts are grasping being, what exists. So Buddhism is going to say, no, that's not how things are. There is no being, so the concepts in our mind are actually empty. They aren't holding any being. Now, to understand that, you have to go beyond the intellect, whatever that means. I don't know how you go beyond the intellect, but that's the discipline of the Eightfold Path, to take you on that path to letting go intellectually. So one must go beyond the intellect or all thought to a state of silence. Now this is good because words express concepts, and in the West, concepts are grasping being. So if there's no being, concepts are empty, words are empty as well. Words don't express any meaning, so to have integrity would be to be silent, and so the highest philosophy is silence. Now, this is something that Shankara in Hinduism also said. Some people think he stole this from Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna says this: it isn't is, and it isn't, and it isn't both, and it isn't neither. Silence. Okay? So, this is similar to Advaita Vedanta. The highest philosophy is silence. Why? Because reason can't grasp meaning. And remember, the way that the Buddha knew he had reached enlightenment was through an experience. So knowledge is through an experience. Now, this is also tricky because we learned that no experience is meaningful without interpretation. So even this experience needs to be interpreted. And we're likely interpreting that experience of nirvana in light of the assumptions that all is impermanence already. So it's a kind of circular argument. But that's a critique. I'll let you think critically about it. So here's what happens. You must go into an enlightened state in which you are neither affirming anything or denying anything. You have to go beyond all thought, beyond all argument, to silence. And this is a state of being. Well, there is no being, so it's a state of momentariness. I don't know what. Now, the most sophisticated form of Buddhism or level of Buddhism is what's called Zen Buddhism. And Zen Buddhism tries to practice this experiential, almost intuitive sense of the moment. Okay, I'm just going to be honest. I haven't experienced it myself. I've tried, but I can get my head around it a little bit. You should try to get your head around it too. I'm going to read you a poem. So Zen Buddhism, it's the cool version of Buddhism. And they practice haiku poems. And the poems are to help you to grasp an insight intuitively. You're supposed to just see it. And I don't know, do I talk about Zen? I'm going to talk about Zen Buddhism right now. In Zen Buddhism, a student learns from a teacher through almost mind-to-mind communication, wordless, silent communication. Apparently, one of the Buddha's last sermons was based on him holding a lotus flower and just holding it, and his students were supposed to grasp the meaning of it. I don't know what they grasp because I wasn't there. I wouldn't probably grasp it anyway. But anyway, here's a poem for you, a haiku poem, and this is from a poet named Basho. I'm just going to read it and then we can discuss what it means. An ancient pond. A frog leaps in. The sound of water. All right, that's the poem. An ancient pond. A frog leaps in. The sound of water. Now, from this poem, we're supposed to grasp something. The momentariness of life. Now, I cheated and looked up someone else's interpretation of the poem, and this is what they said. The ancient pond is like the past in the present. So the ancient, it's been there forever, but it's here now. The frog leaps in the present. The frog is leaping in the present. The sound of water is the intersection between the past and the present. Ooh, so it's now, even though it holds something from the past. Okay, so here's the quote from this guy named Sire. The sound of the intersection of past and present is no sound, for sound takes time. Vibrations are matter in motion. The interface between past and present is not itself a part of matter in motion. So I guess as you study haiku poems more and more, you recognize the now. The now. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up this little piece on the middle path by saying that each line of thought, ethically, metaphysically, epistemologically, each line of thought in Buddhism that takes this conflict with dukkha, suffering, and interprets it comes out in the middle path. Okay? So one can interpret it ethically, metaphysically, epistemologically, and come out in the middle path. So I will let you think about the middle path, and you could read about it some more in your textbook. We're going to move on to talking about what happens after the Buddha dies. So I'm looking at the early councils and early divisions. There are two main divisions in Buddhism. That's the dog snoring, by the way. Our teacher's aide is taking a nap right now. It's so cute. Okay, let me tell you about the early councils. Remember we talked about philosophical religion is when there are challenges that need to be responded to. Usually the philosophers take up those challenges, they settle the dispute, and then they write it down. They come together in councils, they write it down, and it becomes orthodoxy. Well, Buddhism has that too. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a few of these councils and what they did. In 483 before Common Era, so this is shortly after the Buddha dies, at the council, at this council early on, 500 monks formulated an authorized canon and rules governing early Buddhist monasteries. So when you live together in a monastic order, think about dorm living. If you live at a dorm room, you need rules, you need order, you need structure. So this is what they were doing at the first council, where 500 monks came together. So you can think of this as having a discussion. How should we live? What should be the rules for the orders of these monasteries? In about 370 before Common Era, disputes arose about the rules again, and there was a schism between the Mahasangita, which is the great Sangha, the great community, and their interpretation of doctrine. They were kind of liberal in their interpretation, and the Theravadins, or the adherents to the teachings of the elders, and they are going to be more conservative. So we maybe have seen this, we'll see more of this, a split between the conservative and liberal elements in a religion. So here's what happens. We'll talk about these two groups. If you look on the handout, these are the Theravada and the Mahayana splits, or groups, the split. between these two groups. So that's around 300 before Common Era. So they make rules for the different orders, and they allow for differences in Buddhism. You could be a Theravadan or you could be a Mahayana Buddhist. Now, there's one more council I need to tell you about, maybe two. Around 249 before Common Era, this is where they come up with the canon of the teaching of the Buddha. They come up with what's called the Tripitaka. Sometimes you hear it called the Tripitaka, but it's Tripitaka. And the Tripitaka means 3 baskets. And what they had done was put the teachings of the Buddha in 3 different categories. One category is rules for Buddhists in monasteries, the Buddhist order. The second is dialogues between the Buddha and his students. What was he teaching them? And the third is metaphysical instruction about ultimate reality and the middle path. All right, so this becomes the orthodox teaching of Buddhism, the Tripitaka. And then from the 1st or 2nd century Common Era, we have commentaries that are written by scholars, by practitioners, and they want to commit the teaching of the Buddha to writing so that they could pass it on to others in the future. So they realize that they need to write things down and preserve it. All right, this is where you get orthodoxy, coming through these councils, through discussion, and through people writing it down and preserving it. All right, now let's talk about the Theravada and Mahayana sects of Buddhism and what the differences are. And I'm going to make this sort of short and succinct. The first is the Theravada, and they think they're the original, the teaching of the elders. Sometimes it's called Hinayana. That's kind of a derogatory term now, but it means the small vehicle. Hinayana is small vehicle, where Mahayana or Mahasangita is great vehicle, or the great Sangha. So Theravada is the teaching of the elders, and the focus for Theravada Buddhism is on the individual self, the salvation of the individual. And that's why it's called small vehicle. Imagine, I don't know, going down a river in a small canoe by yourself. That's Theravada. And this is monastic. You leave your home and you live in a monastery and you live a celibate life. Celibate, no marriage. And you live in the community. So men live in the monastery with monks, women with nuns. And the person who's practicing this version of Buddhism is called an arat. And the arat is the individual person who's working out their salvation, their quest for nirvana. All right, Theravada, focus on the individual. Mahayana is focused on the community. So this is the great Sangha, or the great community, or the large vehicle. So think about, I don't know, a cruise ship with lots of people on the ship. All of those people are pursuing enlightenment, nirvana, salvation together. Okay, so the Mahayana Buddhists work for the salvation of all people. This is societal. It's changing the world kind of thing. In this sect of Buddhism, you don't have to leave home. It's not monastic. Why? Because it's for society, and in order to save society, you have to have society, which means you need to have children, you need to be involved in family and in culture. So it's inclusive of all. And the person who is trying to bring enlightenment to the community is called the Bodhisattva. Remember we talked about the Bodhisattva, enlightened teacher? The Bodhisattva is one who comes to bring salvation to others and teach like Buddha taught. So they're compassionate. They withhold full nirvana in order to come and teach the rest of us. So you can think about the difference between individual salvation, Theravada, and collective, communal, societal salvation, Mahayana. All right, now let's talk about how do you become a Buddhist. Is there like something you need to do? Not really. There's just something you need to say. So here's how you become a Buddhist. You could try this at home. I'm not sure I would advocate that, but here it is. You become a Buddhist by taking the 3 refuges. Okay, so the first refuge is, I take refuge in the Buddha. You just say this, I take refuge in the Buddha. The second is, I take refuge in the Dharma. The Dharma is the teaching, and the teaching is the fourfold path. Remember, all is dukkha, dukkha arises, dukkha ceases, follow the eightfold path. So, the 4 noble truths and the eightfold path. So I take refuge in the Dharma. And then the third is, I take refuge in the Sangha. And the Sangha, again, is the religious community, the body of Buddhists. So you say, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, the teaching, I take refuge in the Sangha, the community. And refuge is, that's where I find my home. And so by uttering these words, you become a Buddhist. And this is what all Buddhists apparently do. You become a Buddhist by saying these things. Okay, I'd like to wrap up our discussion of Buddhism by talking about its spread. Where does Buddhism go? So I'm going to look at the spread of Buddhism now. It depends on it. So it spreads depending on how it was supported politically. So first it spreads by missionary activity. People going out and making converts, talking, teaching others, talking to others, teaching others, and bringing them into Buddhism from whatever religion they were previously. Now, there's pros and cons to people having political support for religion. Here's the con. If people are going to convert to Buddhism, probably originally from Hinduism, then they're going to leave their life. They're going to turn their backs on society. And then who will support them? Does the government support them? Does the family support them? Who's going to take care of these people? So that's kind of a downside. What happens to society if people aren't really supporting working for society anymore? Kind of a downside. But the upside, and some political leaders saw this, is that Buddhists are peaceful people. They practice ahimsa, no harm. And they usually submit to their leaders. They think it's right to submit to authority. So political leaders thought, hey, that's an upside to this religion. So the religion usually spread where political figures supported it. So it began in India, but it didn't last very long there because it got absorbed back into Hinduism. Remember, Hinduism says all is one and there's a place for everyone. There's a place for Buddhists too. We can absorb you back into Hinduism. There was a leader, Ashoka, in the 230s before Common Era, who tried to make Buddhism the national religion of India after he saw war happen, and he thought this was a way to bring peace. He thought a religion of peace was needed, but it didn't last in India. It went north to Tibet, and in Tibet it's called Lamaism, and that's where you get the Dalai Lama. So as Buddhism goes to different groups, different regions, different nations, it takes on a different flavor. So Lamaism is in Tibet. It goes east to China around the 4th century Common Era. It's still popular in China. It goes south to Sri Lanka. It goes southeast to Asia. It goes to Japan by the 9th century Common Era. That's where Zen Buddhism is practiced. In China, there's Zen Buddhism too, but it's called Chai. It goes to Korea. And it goes to the west coast of the United States as people migrate to the west coast. So Buddhism is big in California. All right, so it does spread, and it is still very popular. I don't know, it seems like Buddhism is making a comeback. I think it's because it's compatible with atheism, and there are some science figures like Sam Harris who sort of endorses Buddhism. You could look into it. Some people think maybe the Eightfold Path is a kind of universal ethical teaching that we could use. I don't know. I'll let you think about it. There may be some universal principles there, but do we need to go with the metaphysics of Buddhism? I don't know. I'll let you think about that. Okay, I think we're going to pause here. If you want to, I'd like you to look into some of these other topics listed here. The Bodhidharma is a philosopher. I think I should tell you a little bit about Bodhidharma. He took Nagarjuna's teaching about the middle path, and he took it to China. And he also was involved with some Shaolin martial arts. He had a particular branch of martial arts that he developed. And he took it to the max. I don't think he kept with the middle path. There are stories about Bodhidharma that he practiced what's called wall contemplation, where you stare at the wall and you meditate in order to empty your mind of all thought. Blinking was distracting him, so he apparently cut his eyelids off. And he sat for, 12, 13 years staring at the wall. People would bring him food. But his legs atrophied and he went blind. But apparently he was closer to nirvana this way. So you could do some research, read about Bodhidharma. These are other ways of practicing Buddhism, Tendai and Shingon, Nichiren and Pure Land. Those are sects within Mahayana Buddhism, and they're different ways of being Buddhist. And I mentioned Zen Buddhism. Internal challenges are just coming from these different branches. They challenge one another just by being divided. External challenges are going to be Hinduism, the West, secularism. I guess maybe some secularists are trying to make Buddhism compatible with secularism. I don't think it works. And then we'll have to think about the response to the modern world. Again, everyone in the modern world has to deal with the questions of science, the secular, religion, and reason. So those are some of the challenges, and you could read about them in your textbook. I'm going to pause because we're going long, and this is the end of our unit on Buddhism. So I would encourage you to review your textbook chapter on Buddhism and read it in conjunction with these lectures. And I will see you in our next unit.